Hi, everyone. So, I have been reading short stories to you guys recently, but I was thinking we have a lot of time that we get to spend at home. And sometimes when we're home, it's good to snuggle up with a long book that you can read or listen to. So, I found one of my favorite books of all time from when I was little, and I want to read some of it to you guys. That's why I have my reading glasses on. Most of my friends don't usually see me with these glasses because I only wear them when I'm on my computer for a long time or when I'm reading for a long, long time. So that's why I have my reading glasses on. So we're going to read Roald Dahl, the BFG. Roald Dahl wrote this book and he writes lots of really great books. And it is a chapter book. Look how many pages are in this book. So we'll read a little bit today and then a little bit more later. And then we'll keep reading until we're all done with the book. The BFG by Roald Dahl. And it is a chapter book, but there are some illustrations. So when we get to an illustration, a picture, I'll show it to you. Like this down here. It says, The Witching Hour. Sophie couldn't sleep. A brilliant moonbeam was slanting through a gap in the curtains. It was shining right onto her pillow. The other children in the dormitory had been asleep for hours. Sophie closed her eyes and lay quite still. She tried very hard to doze off. It was no good. The moonbeam was like a silver blade slicing through the room onto her face. The house was absolutely silent. No voices came up from downstairs. There were no footsteps on the floor above either. The window behind the curtain was wide open, but nobody was walking on the pavement outside. No cars went by on the street. Not even the tiniest sound could be heard anywhere. Sophie had never known such silence. You can see Sophie here. She's laying in her bed. Perhaps, she told herself, this was what they called the witching hour. The witching hour, somebody had once whispered to her, was a special moment in the middle of the night when every child and grown-up was in a deep, deep sleep. And all the dark things came out from hiding and had the world to themselves. The moonbeam was brighter than ever on Sophie's pillow. She decided to get out of bed and close the gap in the curtains. You got punished if you were caught out of bed after lights out, even if you said you had to go to the lavatory. That's another word for bathroom. That was not accepted as an excuse, and they punished you just the same. But there was no one about now. Sophie was sure of it. She reached out for her glasses that lay on the chair beside her bed. They had steel rims and very thick lenses, and she could hardly see a thing without them. Oh, I have glasses too. Then she slipped out of bed and tiptoed over to the window. When she reached the curtains, Sophie hesitated. She longed to duck underneath them and lean out of the window to see what the world looked like now that the witching hour was at hand. She listened again. Everywhere it was deathly still. The longing to look out became so strong she couldn't resist it. Quietly, she ducked under the curtains and leaned out of the window. In the silvery moonlight, the village streets she knew so well seemed completely different. The house looked bent and crooked, like houses in a fairy tale. Everything was pale and ghostly and milky white. Across the road, she could see Mrs. Rance's shop, where you bought buttons and wool and bits of elastic. It didn't look real. There was something dim and misty about it, too. Sophie allowed her eyes to travel further and further down the street. Suddenly, she froze. There was something coming up the street on the opposite side. It was something black. Something tall and black. Something very tall and very black and very thin. Ooh. Who? I wonder what it was. We're on to a new chapter. It says, who? Who? It wasn't a human. It couldn't be. It was 4 times as tall as the tallest human. It was so tall, its head was higher than the upstairs window of a house. Sophie opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat, like her whole body, was frozen with fright. This was the witching hour, all right. The tall black figure was coming her way. It was keeping very close to the house across the street, hiding in the shadowy places where there was no moonlight. On it came, nearer and nearer, but it was moving in spurts. It would stop, then it would move on. Then it would stop again. But what on earth was it doing? Aha! Sophie could see now what it was up to. It was stopping in front of each house. It would stop and peer into the upstairs windows of each place in the street. It was actually hard to bend down to peer into the upstairs window. That's how tall it was. It would stop and peer in. Then it would slide on to the next house and stop again. And peer in, and so on, all along the street. It was much closer now, and Sophie could see it more clearly. Looking at it carefully, she decided it had to be some kind of person. Obviously not a human, but it was definitely a person. A giant person, perhaps. Sophie stared hard across the misty moonlight street. The giant, if that was what he was wearing a long black cloak, like a long jacket. In one hand, he was holding what looked like a very long, thin trumpet. In the other hand, he held a large suitcase. The giant had stopped now right in front of Mr. and Miss Gucci's house. The Guccis had a greengrocer shop in the middle of the high street, and the family lived above the shop. The 2 Gucci's children slept in the upstairs front room. Sophie knew that. The giant was peering through the window into the room where Michael and Jane Gucci were sleeping. From across the street, Sophie watched and held her breath. She saw the giant step back and pace and put the suitcase down on the pavement. He bent over and opened the suitcase. He took something out of it. It looked like a glass jar. One of those square ones with the screw on top. He unscrewed the top of the jar and poured what was in it into the end of the long trumpet thing. Sophie watched, trembling. She saw the giant straighten up again, and she saw him poke the trumpet in through the open upstairs window of the room where the Gucci children were sleeping. She saw the giant take a deep breath, and woof, he blew through the trumpet. I wonder what he's doing. Here's an illustration. It's very shadowy. You can see the giant right here. And then this is the house, probably the Gucci's house. No noise came out, but it was obvious to Sophie that whatever happened to be in the jar had now been blown through the trumpet into the Gucci's children's bedroom. What could it be? As the giant withdrew the trumpet from the window and bent down to pick up the suitcase, he happened to turn his head and glance across the street. In the moonlight, Sophie caught a glimpse of an enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face with the most enormous ears. The nose was sharp as a knife, and above the nose, the nose was as sharp as a knife, and above the nose there were 2 bright, flashing eyes. And the eyes were staring straight at Sophie. There was a fierce and devilish look about them. Sophie gave a yelp and pulled back from the window. She flew across the dormitory and jumped into bed and hid under the blankets. And there she crouched, still as a mouse, and tingling all over. I think we can read maybe one more chapter. The Snatch. Underneath is an illustration of a hand. Looks like he's grabbing something. Let's find out. Under the blanket, Sophie waited. After a minute or so, she lifted the corner of the blanket and peeped out. For the second time that night, her blood froze to ice and she wanted to scream, but no sound came out. There, at the window, with the curtains pushed aside, was the enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face of the giant person staring in. The flashing black eyes were fixed on Sophie's bed. The next moment, a huge hand with pale fingers came snaking in through the window. This was followed by an arm as thick as a tree trunk, and the arm, the hand, the fingers were reaching out across the room towards Sophie's bed. This time, Sophie really did scream, but only for a second, because very quickly the huge hand clamped down over her blanket and the scream was smothered by the bedclothes. Sophie, crouching underneath the blanket, felt a strong fingers grasp hold of her, and then she was lifted up from the bed, blankets and all, and whisked out of the window. If you can think of anything more terrifying than that happening to you in the middle of the night, then let's hear about it. The awful thing was that Sophie knew exactly what was going on, although she couldn't see it happening. She knew that the monster, or giant, with an enormous, long, pale, wrinkly face and dangerous eyes, had plucked her from her bed in the middle of the witching hour and was now carrying her out through the window, smothered in a blanket. What actually happened next was this. When the giant had got Sophie outside, he arranged the blanket so that he could grasp all four corners of it at once in one of his huge hands, with Sophie imprisoned inside. In the other hand, he seized the suitcase and the long trumpet thing, and off he ran. Sophie, by squirming around inside the blanket, managed to push the top of her head out through a little gap just below the giant's hand. She stared around her. She saw the village house rushing by on both sides. The giant was sprinting down High Street. He was running so fast his black cloak, that's that word for coat, was streaming out behind him. Ooh. There's another illustration. There he goes. I think you can see Sophie there in her blankets. And there's his trumpet and his suitcase and his long cloak going behind him. Each stride he took was as long as a tennis court. Out of the village he ran as soon as they were racing across the moonlit fields. The hedges divided from fields were no problem for the giant. He just simply strode over them. A wide river appeared in his path. He crossed it in one flying stride. Sophie crouched in the blanket, peering out. She was being bumped against the giant's legs like a sack of potatoes. Over the fields and hedges and rivers they went, and after a while a frightening thought came into Sophie's head. The giant is running fast, she told herself, because he is hungry and he wants to get home quickly as possible, and then he'll have me for breakfast. Uh-oh. I hope not. I wonder what's going to happen next to Sophie and the giant. All right, I'm gonna put in a bookmark and we'll read some more chapters later. Bye, guys.